Welcome to my Channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. The rusted yellow bus sits at the corner of Maple and 3rd every Monday morning at 7:15 a.m. sharp, picking up passengers who haven't been children for 30 years. I know because I've been watching it for the past 3 weeks. And tomorrow, I think I'm getting on. But wait, let me tell you something first. Something that might save your life, or at least your sanity. If you see an old school bus in your neighborhood on a Monday morning, and you graduated more than 10 years ago, don't look at the driver. Don't make eye contact. And whatever you do, don't remember your old bus number, because once you remember, he remembers you too. Now, let the story begin. My name is Sarah Chen, and I work from home as a graphic designer in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. 3 weeks ago, I was nursing my second cup of coffee, black, no sugar, when I heard it. That unmistakable diesel rumble mixed with squeaky brakes that transported me straight back to 1994. A school bus. Now, there's an elementary school 4 blocks away, sure. But their buses run down Washington Avenue, never through our quiet suburban street. I peeked through my kitchen blinds, just a quick look, and there it was. Bus number 47. My old bus number from Franklin Middle School. The thing is, Franklin Middle School was demolished in 2001. I rubbed my eyes, blinked hard. The bus was still there, idling at the corner where no bus stop had ever existed. The paint was faded, more brown than yellow now. Rust ate through the wheel wells like cancer. And the windows, God, the windows were so dark I couldn't see inside. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl. The bus was humming. Not the engine, something else. A low, subsonic vibration that seemed to resonate in my bones. My coffee cup started rattling against the saucer, tiny ripples forming on the surface like I was in a scene from Jurassic Park. Then the door opened, nobody got on, nobody got off. The door just hung open for maybe 30 seconds. The driver never moved. I could barely make out his silhouette, broad shoulders, baseball cap, sitting perfectly still. But his head was tilted at an angle that wasn't quite right. Too far to the left, like he was listening to something only he could hear. The smell hit me next, even through my closed windows, even from across the street. It was the smell of old leather and forgotten lunches, of teenage anxiety and institutional disinfectant. But underneath all that was something else, something organic and wrong, like fruit left too long in a locker over summer vacation. Then the door closed with that pneumatic hiss I remembered so well, and the bus rolled away. But here's what really scared me. As it drove past my house, I could swear I heard something from inside. Children's voices. Not talking or laughing, singing. That old camp song we used to sing on field trips. The wheels on the bus go round and round, round and round, round and round. Except they were singing it backwards, and in harmony. Perfect, eerie harmony that made my teeth ache. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Some vintage bus enthusiast, maybe. Cedar Rapids had all kinds of quirky people, but my hands were shaking as I poured my 3rd cup of coffee, and I noticed I'd been holding my breath. The weird thing was, after the bus left, I couldn't remember what I'd been working on. I stared at my computer screen for 10 minutes, looking at a half-finished logo design that meant nothing to me. It was like someone had reached into my brain and deleted the last hour of my life. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my high school friend Janet Morrison. She'd kept in touch with more people from our old crowd than I had. Janet, this is going to sound weird, but do you remember our bus number from middle school? There was a pause. Too long of a pause. Sarah? Sarah Chen from Franklin? Yeah, it's me. I know it's been forever, but why are you asking about bus numbers?" Her voice had gone flat, careful. I thought I saw our old bus this morning, number 47. But that's impossible, right? Because the line went dead. I called back 3 times. Each time it went straight to voicemail. By the 4th call, the number was disconnected. That evening, I tried to find Janet on social media. Her Facebook profile was gone, her Instagram deleted. It was like she'd vanished from the internet entirely. But in my search, I found something else. A memorial page for Franklin Middle School. I'd never seen it before, despite living in the same town for most of my adult life. The page had dozens of comments from former students, sharing memories. But as I scrolled through them, I noticed something strange. Nobody mentioned Bus 47. They talked about other routes, other drivers. Bus 23 with Mrs. Patterson. Bus 16 with Mr. Garcia. But not a single mention of Harold Whitman or Bus 47. It was like 23 kids had collectively agreed to forget the most traumatic event of their middle school years. The next Monday, I was ready. Camera app open on my phone. 7:14 a.m. But this time, I wasn't just watching from my kitchen. I'd positioned myself across the street behind Mrs. Kowalski's hedge. Close enough to see details. Close enough to maybe understand what the hell was happening to my neighborhood. 7:15 a.m. There it was. Same corner, same bus, same number, 47. But this time, I could see more. The rust wasn't just on the wheel wells. It covered the entire bus like a disease, eating through the yellow paint in patterns that almost looked like faces. Screaming faces pressed against the metal from the inside. I started recording. Through my phone screen, I watched as the door opened. And this time someone got on. It was Mrs. Kowalski. My elderly neighbor walked up to the bus in her bathrobe and fuzzy slippers, moving with the mechanical precision of a sleepwalker. She climbed the steps without hesitation, without looking back. The door closed behind her. But here's the thing that made me drop my phone. Mrs. Kowalski was standing right behind me. I could hear her breathing. When I turned around, she was there, staring at the bus with empty eyes. "Beautiful morning for a ride," she said in a voice that wasn't quite hers. "Don't you think, dear?" I looked back at the bus. Through the dark windows, I could see her silhouette taking a seat. The same woman in 2 places at once. The bus began to move, and as it passed us, the windows flickered. For just a moment, they became transparent. And I saw them. Dozens of passengers, all ages, all wearing clothes from different eras. A woman in a 1950s dress, a man in a disco-era shirt, a teenager in grunge flannel, and in the very back seat, a little girl in a purple windbreaker with butterflies on it. A little girl who looked exactly like me at age 13. The bus rounded the corner and disappeared. My phone was dead. Completely dead. When I finally got it to restart an hour later, the video was gone. But there was something else in my gallery. A photo I'd never taken. It was me, age 13, standing at a bus stop in my purple windbreaker, the one with the butterflies on it. The photo was taken from inside a bus, through a window, and in the reflection of that window, I could see the photographer. He was wearing a baseball cap. But there was more. In the background of the photo, barely visible, I could see other kids. My classmates from Franklin Middle School. But they were all wrong. Their faces were too old for their bodies. 13-year-old bodies with adult eyes, filled with knowledge no child should possess. And they were all looking directly at the camera. Directly at me. Their mouths were open, but not in surprise. They were singing something. The same song I'd heard the day before. The wheels on the bus go round and round. I spent the next week doing what any rational person would do. researching every possible explanation. Carbon monoxide leak in my house? I bought 3 detectors, all clear. Hallucinations. I scheduled a doctor's appointment, perfect bill of health. I even called the school district. Bus number 47? The woman on the phone sounded confused. Ma'am, we retired that number in E6, after the incident. What incident? The line went quiet for so long I thought she'd hung up. Ma'am, are you a journalist? No, I'm just... Because we don't discuss the incident with journalists. Company policy. I'm not a journalist. I was a student. I was on that bus. Another long pause. I could hear papers rustling, keyboard clicks. I'm sorry, she said finally. Our records show that bus route 47 was discontinued due to mechanical issues. No incident, no passengers. Are you sure you have the right number? Yes, I'm sure. Harold Whitman was the driver. 23 kids went missing for 3 days in May 6. It was all over the news. Ma'am, I've been with this district for 30 years. There's never been a driver named Harold Whitman. I'm sorry, I can't help you. Have a nice day. She hung up before I could say anything else. That's when I turned to the internet. And what I found... Jesus, what I found made me wish I'd never looked. The search results were wrong, not just incomplete, wrong. Every article about the disappearance had been altered. The dates were different. The location was different. According to the internet, 23 high school students from Washington High had disappeared in 1997, not middle schoolers from Franklin in 1996. But I remembered the photos. I remembered the faces. These were my classmates, just aged up by a year and moved to a different school. Someone was changing the records, systematically, deliberately. I tried the Des Moines Register archives next. The physical archives, not the digital ones. I drove 3 hours to Des Moines and spent 6 hours in their basement, going through microfilm from May 6. And there it was. Page 1, May 16th, 1996. 23 students disappear. But when I tried to print the article, the machine malfunctioned. When I went to find a librarian, she told me that particular microfilm had been damaged and was no longer available for viewing. But I was just looking at it, I said. I'm sorry, miss. That's impossible. The May 96 edition was destroyed in a flood last year. I looked back at the microfilm reader. The screen was blank. May 15th, 1996. Bus 47. Driver Harold Whitman. Disappeared with a full load of students on a Monday morning. They found the bus 3 days later in a cornfield outside Palo. Empty. No signs of struggle. No blood. No explanation. The kids, all 23 of them, turned up at their homes that Wednesday evening. None of them remembered anything about those 3 days. Not a single thing. Harold Whitman was never found. I remembered that week. I was in 8th grade. My parents had been terrified. Keeping me home from school, watching the news constantly, but I'd forgotten about it. Completely forgotten. Until now. And that's when it hit me. The memory came flooding back like a dam bursting. Not the 3 missing days. I still couldn't remember those, but I remembered the day we came home. I remembered walking up my driveway in the purple windbreaker, my backpack heavy with books I couldn't remember packing. I remembered my parents crying, hugging me so tight I could barely breathe. I remembered the police officers in our living room, asking questions I couldn't answer. Where have you been, Sarah? I don't know. Do you remember getting on the bus Monday morning? Maybe? It's fuzzy. Do you remember Mr. Whitman, your bus driver? And that's when the strangest thing happened. I opened my mouth to say, of course I remember Mr. Whitman. But instead, what came out was, we don't have a bus driver named Mr. Whitman. The police officers exchanged looks. Sarah, Harold Whitman has been driving your bus route for 3 years. No, I said, and I believed it. completely. Our driver is Mrs. Patterson, bus 23. But even as I said it, I knew it was wrong. Mrs. Patterson drove bus 23. She picked up the kids on the north side of town. I lived on the south side. Bus 47, the memory was fighting itself in my head. Two versions of reality, both equally real, both equally false. The police officer leaned forward. "Sarah, what's the last thing you remember from Monday morning?" I closed my eyes and tried to think. I remember getting ready for school. I remember Mom making pancakes because it was a special day for some reason. I remember putting on my windbreaker, and then I remember walking up the driveway Wednesday night. Nothing in between? Nothing. But that was a lie. There was something in between, not memories exactly. More like impressions. The taste of pennies in my mouth, the sound of children crying, the feeling of being watched by something that wasn't human, and the song, always the song. The wheels on the bus go round and round. I dug deeper, found an old newspaper archive online that hadn't been scrubbed yet. The Des Moines Register, May 20th, 96. There was a photo of the missing kids, standing in front of the school, looking dazed but unharmed. I was in that photo. Third row, purple windbreaker. But so were kids I'd never seen before in my life. Kids who definitely weren't at Franklin Middle School in 1996. I recognized some of them from other school photos, other years. Jenny Martinez, who graduated in 1994. David Kim, who didn't move to Cedar Rapids until 1998. It was like someone had photoshopped together students from different years, different schools, different decades even, and presented them as the missing 23. My mouth went dry. I didn't just not remember being on that bus. I was beginning to doubt I'd ever been on any bus, which was impossible because I lived 4 miles from school. I had to take the bus. Didn't I? I called my mom in Florida. "Mom, do you remember when I was in 8th grade? That thing with the bus?" Silence. "Mom? Why are you asking about that, honey?" I found an old newspaper article and, "Sarah, sweetie, you were never on that bus. You were sick that week, remember? Strep throat." But I was looking at the photo. I was literally looking at myself in the photo. "Mom, I can see myself in the, you were never on that bus." Her voice was different now. Flat, mechanical. "You were sick, strep throat. Dr. Morrison gave you antibiotics." Dr. Morrison. I remembered Dr. Morrison, except he'd died in 1993, 3 years before the bus incident. "Mom, are you okay? You were never on that bus, Sarah." Never on the bus, never on the bus, never. "Mom, Dr. Morrison was dead by then, remember? He had that heart attack at the golf course." Silence. Then, "Who's Dr. Morrison? Sarah, you're scaring me. Maybe you should see someone. Talk to a professional." "You just said Dr. Morrison gave me antibiotics." "I never said that, honey. I said Dr. Reeves. Dr. Reeves gave you antibiotics for your strep throat. You were never on the bus." I hung up. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the phone. But here's the thing that really terrified me. I called my mom back immediately, asked her what we'd just talked about. "Oh, just checking in, honey, making sure you're okay. You sounded a little stressed." "Mom, we were just talking about middle school, about the bus incident." "What bus incident?" "Sarah, you're starting to worry me. Have you been sleeping okay?" She had no memory of our conversation. None at all. Like someone had reached into her brain and deleted the last 10 minutes. That night, I had the dream for the first time. I'm 13 again, standing at a bus stop that doesn't exist anymore, wearing that purple windbreaker. Bus 47 pulls up, the door opens. Mr. Whitman is driving, except his face is wrong. It's too long, too pale. And when he smiles, God, when he smiles, his mouth opens sideways. "Running late again, Sarah?" His voice sounds like it's coming from underwater. "Better hurry, don't want to miss your stop." But in the dream, I remember other mornings. Dozens of Monday mornings, stretching back through years I've never lived. I remember being 8 years old, getting on the same bus driven by the same man who never ages. I remember being 16, 18, 25, still in that purple windbreaker that somehow always fits. I get on the bus. I don't want to, but my legs move on their own. The other kids are already there, all 22 of them. But they're not kids anymore, they're adults, my age, wearing their old school clothes that don't fit right. Jessica Palmer's in her cheerleading uniform, the skirt barely reaching her thighs. Tommy Morrison's in his football jersey, his beer belly stretching the numbers. They're all staring straight ahead, not blinking, not breathing, but behind them, in seats that shouldn't exist, are others. Older passengers, adults in clothes from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. All of them with children's eyes, all of them humming that song. I sit in my old seat, 4th row, left side, by the window. The bus starts moving. "Next stop," Mr. Whitman announces, though his mouth doesn't move. 1990. The bus lurches forward, and suddenly we're not on roads anymore. We're driving through time itself, past moments that blur together like watercolors in the rain. I see my house at different ages, my parents getting younger, then older, then younger again. I see myself at 5, at 10, at 15, at 30, all standing in the same spot, all watching the bus pass. And I realize the horrible truth. This isn't just one trip. This is every trip. Every Monday morning for the rest of eternity, picking up the same passengers, driving to the same destination that doesn't exist. I woke up screaming, but when I checked my clock, it was Monday morning. 7:15 a.m., and outside my window, I could hear the diesel engine of Bus 47 waiting at the corner. The next morning, Saturday, I did something stupid. I drove to Palo, to the cornfield where they found the bus. It's a subdivision now, cookie-cutter houses with perfect lawns, but at the end of Meadowbrook Lane, there's an empty lot. Nothing will grow there. The realtor's sign has been up so long it's bleached white. I parked my car and walked onto the lot. The ground felt wrong under my feet, soft in places where it should be hard, hard where it should be soft. Like walking on something sleeping, and that's when I noticed the silence. Complete, absolute silence. No birds, no insects, no traffic sounds from the nearby street. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, like the air itself was absorbing sound. That's when I saw them. The others. Jessica Palmer was standing by the eastern edge of the lot, still in her work clothes from the bank. But her clothes were wrong too. The fabric looked faded, like she'd been wearing them for years. Tommy Morrison was there too, in his contractor's gear, but his hard hat had rust stains that looked suspiciously like handprints. Maria Santos, Kevin Wu, all of them. All 22. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We all knew why we were there. We were remembering. Not all at once. Just flashes. The inside of the bus smelling like copper and mildew. Mr. Whitman's hands on the steering wheel, too many fingers. Driving through streets that weren't streets, past houses that weren't houses. The other kids on the bus, kids who graduated in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, all of them 13 again. All of them crying without making a sound, and the destination. God, the destination. It wasn't a place. It was a time. Or maybe it was the space between times. A gray, endless expanse where Monday morning lasted forever. Where you could be 13 for eternity, carrying the weight of adult knowledge in a child's body. Never aging, never growing, never escaping the feeling that you were late for something important. "He's coming back," Jessica said suddenly. Her voice was hollow. "Every Monday, looking for the ones who got away." "We didn't get away," Tommy said. "He let us go. Because we weren't ready yet." "Ready for what?" I asked. Nobody answered. Because we all knew. Deep down, in that place where childhood nightmares live, we knew. Ready to remember. Ready to understand what we'd seen during those 3 missing days. Ready to choose between the gray eternity of Monday morning and the terrifying uncertainty of growing up. "My daughter takes the bus," Maria said suddenly. "Route 12. She's 13. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Move," Kevin said. "Just move away. Far away." "I tried," Tommy said. "Moved to Chicago in 2003. You know what happened. I saw the bus there too. Different number. But same driver. Same fucking driver." "He follows," Jessica whispered. "Once you've been on, he follows." "But why?" I asked. "What does he want?" Maria laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He wants us to choose. Stay children forever, or grow up and forget. Most of us forget. The forgetting it's a mercy. But some of us remember, and the ones who remember have to come back," Kevin finished. "To collect the new ones, to keep the route running. Someone has to drive the bus when Harold gets tired." "That's not true," I said. But even as I said it, I could feel the lie crumbling. Because I'd seen Harold Whitman's face in my dreams. I'd seen how tired he looked, how desperate. "Sarah," Jessica said gently, "check your jacket pocket." I reached into the pocket of the purple windbreaker I'd unconsciously put on that morning. My fingers closed around something warm and smooth. A bus driver's cap. We stood there until the sun started setting. One by one they left, but before they did, each of them whispered something to me. A number, a route, an address. "Bus 23, Jessica whispered. "Washington Elementary, every Tuesday." "Bus 16, Tommy said. "Roosevelt High, Thursdays." "Bus 82, Maria said. "Lincoln Middle School, Wednesdays." They were all drivers now. All of them. Taking turns shepherding the children who remembered. The ones who couldn't let go of what they'd seen in that gray place between Monday and the rest of the week. I was the last one, standing on that cursed ground, holding a bus driver's cap that felt heavier than it should. Sunday night, I made my decision. I packed a bag, laptop, clothes, charger. I was going to drive to my brother's house in Denver, put Cedar Rapids in my rearview mirror and never look back. But at 3 a.m., my car wouldn't start. Dead battery. At 4 a.m., I called an Uber, no drivers available. At 5 a.m., I tried to book a flight. Website crashed, phone lines busy. At 6 a.m., I accepted the truth. You don't run from Mr. Whitman, he lets you go, or he doesn't. At 7 a.m., I made coffee. Black, no sugar. At 7:10 a.m., I put on my purple windbreaker, the one I'd kept in the back of my closet for 30 years, the one with the butterflies. At 7:14 a.m., I stood at the corner of Maple and 3rd. At 7:15 a.m., the bus arrived. The door opened. Mr. Whitman looked exactly the same. Baseball cap, broad shoulders. But when he turned to look at me, his face was older, tired, human. "Been waiting for you, Sarah," he said. His voice was normal, sad even. "They all come back, eventually." I climbed the steps. They groaned under my adult weight. The bus was full, not with kids, with adults, all wearing remnants of their childhood. A varsity jacket here, a band uniform there, all the missing passengers from over the years. But they weren't from '96. I recognized Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store. She'd graduated in 1971. Robert Chang from the post office, class of 1985. And in the very back, wearing a dress from the 1950s, was an elderly woman who smiled at me with perfect recognition. "Hello, dear," she said. "I'm Margaret," I was the first one to remember. 1963. Such a long time ago. "Where are we going?" I asked. Mr. Whitman looked at me in the rearview mirror. His eyes were so tired. "Same place we always go on Mondays," he said, "to pick up the ones who remember." The bus lurched forward. We turned onto streets I knew, then streets I didn't. The houses began to change, newer, older, different. The sky shifted from blue to gray to something that wasn't quite either. "You're not him," I said suddenly. "You're not the real Harold Whitman." The thing wearing Mr. Whitman's face smiled, that sideways smile from my nightmares. Harold was the first one who remembered, it said, back in 1963. He tried to save the others, tried to drive them away from the pickup point. But you can't drive away from something that's already inside the bus. "What are you?" "I'm Monday morning," it said. "I'm the feeling in your stomach when summer ends. I'm the thing that takes you from childhood to whatever comes after. And I'm hungry. So very hungry. For the ones who remember what it felt like to be young." The bus stopped. We were at Franklin Middle School. Not ruins, not a demolition site. Franklin Middle School as it existed in 1996. Perfect, pristine, waiting. "This is your stop, Sarah." I looked at the other passengers. They were all standing, moving toward the door. "What happens if I don't get off?" "Then you ride," it said. "Forever, every Monday, picking up the ones who remember until you forget everything else. And if I do get off, then you go inside. You sit at your old desk, you take the test you never finished. And when the bell rings..." It paused. "Well, nobody's ever heard the bell ring." The door opened. I stood up. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. 13-year-old legs. Scared legs. But then I noticed something. Robert Chang wasn't moving. Neither was Mrs. Henderson. They were staring at me, shaking their heads slightly. "Don't," Robert mouthed silently. I looked back at Mr. Whitman, at the thing pretending to be Mr. Whitman. "No," I said. "No, I'm not getting off, and neither are they." The thing's face rippled. "You don't have a choice." "Wrong," I said. And I remembered something from those 3 missing days. "You can only take us if we choose to go. That's why you let us go in 1996. We were too young to choose, but now we're old enough to know better." The bus shuddered. The school flickered. There one moment, gone the next. "Sit down!" the thing roared. "No," I said. Others started standing with me. "We're not 13 anymore. We're not afraid of Monday mornings. We're not afraid of growing up. And we're not afraid of you." The thing wearing Mr. Whitman's face began to change, melting, reforming, becoming something else, something worse. But before it could finish, Robert Chang did something I'll never forget. He laughed, not a scared laugh, a real laugh, deep and genuine. "You know what?" he said. "I fucking hated middle school anyway." Mrs. Henderson laughed too. Then another passenger. Then another. Until the whole bus was laughing at the melting, reforming thing in the driver's seat. And just like that, we were back on Maple and 3rd. The bus was rust and broken windows. The driver's seat was empty, and we were standing on the sidewalk, all of us. Free. The bus dissolved like morning mist. Just gone. We stood there for a moment. Adults in children's clothes that no longer fit. Then, one by one, we walked away. No words, no explanations, just a shared understanding that some things are better left in the past. Epilogue. The ticket. It's been 3 days since the bus disappeared. Monday came and went. No bus, no Mr. Whitman, no 13-year-old terrors made manifest. But I know it's not over. Not really. Because this morning, I saw something on the news. A school bus in Des Moines. Route 82. Disappeared Monday morning with 15 kids aboard. They found it Wednesday afternoon in a parking lot behind an abandoned mall. The kids were fine. They don't remember anything. But they will. In 30 years or so, they'll remember. And when they do, the bus will come for them. Maybe not number 47, maybe not driven by Harold Whitman, but it will come. So here's my advice. And please, God, listen to me. If you see a school bus on Monday morning, and you graduated more than 10 years ago, don't look. Don't remember your old bus number. Don't put on that old jacket you've been saving. And whatever you do, don't get on. Because some rides never really end. They just wait for you to remember the way back. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. The thing I haven't told anyone else. Yesterday, I found something in my jacket pocket. The purple windbreaker. Something that wasn't there before. A bus ticket. Faded yellow. The kind they used to give out for field trips. It has a date on it, next Monday, and a destination. Terminal stop, Childhood's End. The ticket is warm to the touch. It pulses like it has a heartbeat. And sometimes when I look at it from the corner of my eye, I swear I can see someone's face in the yellow paper. A child's face. My face. 13 years old and terrified. But there's something else about the ticket. Something that makes my blood run cold. In small print, at the bottom, almost too faded to read. Transfer available to routes 23, 16, 82, and all connecting services. And below that, in fresher ink, driver as Chen. So I'm asking you, begging you really, if you've ever been on a Monday bus that felt wrong, if you've ever had 3 days you can't quite remember, if you've ever woken up from a dream about a school that doesn't exist anymore, check your pockets. Check them right now, because if you have a ticket, if you have that warm, pulsing, yellow ticket, then the bus is coming back. And this time, I don't think saying no will be enough. This time, I think it's taking us home, whether we want to go or not. Sweet dreams, and check your pockets. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to know what happens next Monday. And tell me in the comments, do you remember your old bus number? I bet you do now. I bet you can't forget it. Bus 47, Route 82, terminal stop. See you Monday. Story number 2. The ocean doesn't want you here anymore. That's what the old-timer at the gas station told me 3 weeks ago when I mentioned I'd taken the lifeguard position at Seal Point Beach. He just shook his head, rang up my Red Bull and beef jerky, and muttered something about kids not listening anymore. I laughed it off then. I'm not laughing now. You see, there's something you need to understand about Seal Point. It's not on any tourist map. Google barely acknowledges it exists. And yet, the state of California pays me $87,000 a year to sit in a tower and watch a beach where the signs clearly state, "No swimming, permanently closed." Strange, right? But wait, it gets stranger. Before we dive into what happened last night, and why I'm recording this from my car at 3 a.m, shaking like I've got hypothermia even though it's 72 degrees, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt watched by something that wasn't quite human? Not in a paranormal way, but in a way that makes your DNA remember why our ancestors were afraid of the dark? If you're still listening, good. Because someone needs to know the truth about Seal Point Beach. Someone needs to understand why there's always a lifeguard here, even though no one's allowed to swim. Story begins now. My name's Jake Morrison, and until 3 weeks ago, I was just another unemployed 26-year-old with a marine biology degree gathering dust. The job posting appeared on a government website at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I know the exact time because I'd been doom-scrolling through job listings while eating cold pizza, wondering if my parents were right about grad school. Lifeguard position, Seal Point Beach, California, $87,000 year. Immediate start. Single applicant needed. The salary made me blink twice, then 3 times. Most lifeguard positions in California paid maybe 40 grand if you were lucky. This was double that, and then some. The location was about 3 hours north of San Francisco, somewhere along the Lost Coast. I'd never heard of Seal Point, but for that money, I'd guard a swimming pool in Death Valley. The application process was weird. No interview, no swimming test, just a psychological evaluation and a strange questionnaire that asked things like, "Do you have any family history of thalassophobia?" and "Rate your comfort level with isolation on a scale of 1 to 10. I got the job within 12 hours. But before I left for Seal Point, I did what any rational person would do. I tried to research the place. That's when I discovered the first red flag. There were no online reviews, no travel blogs, no mention of Seal Point Beach in any California coastal guides. The only references I found were in obscure maritime records and a few academic papers about unusual tidal patterns along the Lost Coast. One paper, buried in the Journal of Coastal Geology, mentioned anomalous depth readings off Seal Point, where sonar indicated the seafloor dropped to over 3,000 feet less than a quarter mile from shore. For context, that's deeper than the Grand Canyon. Most California beaches have gradual shelves that extend for miles. Seal Point was different. It was like someone had carved a trench right up to the waterline. The drive to Seal Point took me through increasingly empty stretches of Highway 1, the kind where your phone loses signal and the radio stations fade to static, then to something that sounds almost like whispers if you listen too carefully. The GPS kept trying to reroute me, insisting the road ahead didn't exist, but I could see it clearly. Cracked asphalt winding through fog-shrouded cliffs. About an hour before I reached Seal Point, I stopped at a diner in a town called Millbrook. Population 8 of 47, according to the faded sign. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and worried eyes, overheard me asking for directions to Seal Point. "You sure that's where you're headed?" she asked, refilling my coffee without being asked. "Yeah, got a job there. Lifeguarding." Her hand trembled slightly and coffee slopped over the rim of my cup. "Lifeguarding? At Seal Point?" She glanced around the empty diner, then leaned closer. "Honey, you seem like a nice boy. Maybe think about turning around." "Why? What's wrong with Seal Point?" She straightened up, suddenly formal. "Nothing at all. Just, it's quiet there, real quiet. Some folks don't take to the quiet well." But as I was leaving, she pressed a business card into my hand. Local number, handwritten. "If you change your mind about that job, call my nephew. He runs a fishing charter out of Fort Bragg. Good work, safe work." The town of Seal Point had maybe 200 residents. One general store, no restaurants, no hotels, just weathered houses clinging to the hillside like barnacles, and below them, the beach. My first look at Seal Point Beach made my stomach drop in a way I couldn't explain. The sand was pristine, untouched. The waves rolled in perfect sets. It should have been paradise, but something was off. The water was too dark, even for Northern California. Not polluted dark, but dark, like it was deeper than it should be. Like the continental shelf started right at the shoreline. The lifeguard tower sat dead center on the beach, brand new, gleaming white against the gray sand. State-of-the-art equipment inside. Binoculars, first aid kit, radio system, even a laptop with satellite internet. And surrounding it, every 50 feet along the beach, signs. Danger, no swimming. Beach closed, violators will be prosecuted. Hazardous marine conditions. Keep out. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. The signs faced both directions. Half warned people away from the water. The other half faced the ocean. Like they were warning something in the water to stay away from the land. My supervisor, if you could call him that, was a man named Carl Hendricks. Met him once on my first day. Gaunt guy, maybe 60, with eyes that never quite focused on anything. He handed me a laminated card with the rules and told me to memorize them. The rules were simple. 1. Maintain visual surveillance of the water from sunrise to sunset. 2. Log any unusual activity in the official record. 3. Never enter the water for any reason. 4. Never leave the tower during shift hours. If you see someone in the water, do not attempt rescue. Call the emergency number immediately. 6. Never look directly at the water through the binoculars for more than 30 seconds at a time. 7. When the fog comes in, keep your eyes on the beach, not the water. What happens if someone goes in? I asked. Carl just stared past me at the ocean. No one goes in anymore. Not since '97. What happened in '97? He walked away without answering. That was the last time I saw him. But Carl left behind a manila folder in the tower's filing cabinet. Inside were incident reports dating back decades. Handwritten logs from previous lifeguards. The writing got increasingly erratic as you read forward in time. Guard number 7's entries started professional. Wave heights, weather conditions, tourist counts. By his final entry, the handwriting was barely legible. They sing at night now. Don't know how much longer I can pretend not to hear. Guard number 15 had filled 17 pages with the same phrase repeated over and over. The water remembers. The water remembers. The water remembers. Guard number 19's final entry was just a single line. I understand now. It was never about keeping people out. It was about keeping them in. The first week was boring, mind-numbingly boring. I sat in the tower from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., watching absolutely nothing happen. No tourists, no locals. Even the seabirds seemed to avoid the place. Just me, the endless rhythm of waves, and that dark, dark water. I started a journal to pass the time. Noted things like water temperature, 52 degrees, wave height, 3 to 4 feet, wind speed, 5 to 10 knots, normal stuff. But then I started noticing patterns that didn't make sense. The tide charts were wrong. High tide came in 43 minutes later each day, not the standard 50. The waves broke in sequences of 7, always 7, never 6 or 8, and the water temperature never changed, not by a single degree. I checked it every morning with the digital thermometer. 52 degrees, always 52. I mentioned this to Mrs. Hendricks at the general store. Carl's wife, I assumed, though she never confirmed the relationship. She was stocking shelves when I brought up the strange tide schedule. Tide don't follow normal rules here, she said without looking up. Never has. My grandfather used to say the ocean here answers to older laws. Older laws? She paused, a can of green beans halfway to the shelf. This coast's been here for millions of years. Humans been here for maybe a few thousand. You do the math on which set of rules carries more weight. That night, I called my ex-girlfriend Sarah. Needed to hear a familiar voice. She was a marine biologist too. Better than me, actually. When I described the temperature readings, she laughed. That's impossible, Jake. Ocean temperature fluctuates constantly. Currents, weather, time of day, seasonal changes. There's no way it stays constant. I'm telling you, Sarah. 52 degrees, every single day. A long pause. Send me your data. I'll run it by my professor. I never heard back from her. When I tried calling again, her number was disconnected. On day 8, I saw my first swimmer. Or, I thought I did. It was around 2 p.m. The sun was high, no fog, perfect visibility. Movement in the water caught my eye about 200 yards out. I grabbed the binoculars, remembering Rule 6, don't look for more than 30 seconds. 20 seconds in, I saw it. A head. Human-shaped, but wrong. The proportions were off, too large. Hair that moved independently of the water's motion. and when it turned toward shore, toward me, I dropped the binoculars. The eyes were looking directly at me. Not at the beach, not at the tower, at me, like it knew exactly where I was sitting. I logged it in the record as possible marine mammal sighting and tried to forget the way those eyes had too many colors in them, colors that don't exist in nature, colors that hurt to remember. What I didn't write in that log entry was what happened immediately after I dropped the binoculars. The thing in the water, and I was certain now it wasn't a seal or dolphin, didn't dive or swim away like a startled animal would. Instead, it began moving laterally along the surf line, keeping the same distance from shore, but positioning itself directly in front of the tower. Then it started. Performing? That's the only word I can use. It would surface, remain visible for exactly 10 seconds, then submerge. Surface again 50 yards to the left. 10 seconds, submerge. Surface 50 yards to the right. Always the same timing. Always the same distance. Like it was following a choreographed routine designed specifically for my observation, this continued for 47 minutes. I timed it. By the end, I was certain of two things. Whatever was in the water was intelligent, and it wanted me to know it was intelligent. The performance wasn't random animal behavior. It was communication, an introduction, a way of saying, I see you seeing me. That evening, I found something that chilled me to the bone. Tucked behind the emergency radio in the tower was a notebook I'd somehow missed during my initial exploration. The cover was warped from salt air, pages yellow and brittle. Inside, written in a dozen different hands, were observations that mirrored my own. Day 12. They're learning my schedule. Surface times now coincide exactly with my binocular sweeps. Guard number 8. The patterns are intentional, mathematical. They're showing me something, but I don't understand what. Guard number 14. Started leaving shells on the beach overnight. Perfect spirals, arranged in sequences of 7. They know I count everything in 7s now. They're adapting to my mind. Guard number 16. But the entry that made my hands shake was from guard number 21. They're not trying to communicate with me. They're training me. Each guard becomes more receptive, more attuned to their frequency. By the time we understand what they want, we can't refuse. The job isn't to watch them. The job is to let them watch us, to let them learn how we think, how we react, how we break. That night, I made a mistake. I went back to the beach after my shift ended. I told myself I was being scientific, investigating. But really, I was drawn there by something I couldn't name. The same compulsion that makes you check a door you know you've already locked. The beach at night was different. The sand seemed to absorb sound, making every footstep unnaturally quiet. The waves continued their pattern of 7, but in the darkness they sounded like breathing. Slow, deep breaths from something impossibly large. I sat on the bottom step of the tower and waited. I'm not sure what I was waiting for, but I knew something would happen. The air tasted of salt and copper, and the stars seemed dimmer than they should be, as if something in the water was absorbing their light. At 11:43 p.m., the exact time the scout troop had entered the water in 1997, they came. Not the swimmers I'd seen during the day. These were different, larger, more confident in their movements. They emerged from the deeper water in a perfect line, moving with purpose toward the shore. In the moonlight, their forms were clearer, more defined, and infinitely more disturbing. They walked upright, but their proportions were wrong in ways that made my brain hurt to process. Limbs too long, torsos too narrow, heads that tilted at angles that shouldn't be anatomically possible. And they were looking at me, all of them, moving in unison, but each set of eyes fixed directly on my position. When the water reached their waists, they stopped. The one in the center raised something that might have been an arm. In its grip was an object that caught the moonlight, metallic, familiar. It was my phone, which had been in my pocket moments before, which was somehow now in the possession of something that had never left the water. The thing held it up, and the screen illuminated. My own voice echoed across the empty beach, playing the recording I'd started that afternoon. My observations, my growing understanding, my fear. They had been listening, not just watching. They had found a way to access my thoughts, my recordings, my private attempts to make sense of what was happening. The central figure tossed the phone back. It landed in the sand at my feet, screen cracked but still functional, still recording. By week 2, I'd established a routine. Coffee at 5:30 a.m. from my thermos, tower by 5:45. Watch the sunrise paint the water from black to deep blue to that unsettling dark green it maintained all day. Log the conditions, scan the beach, check the water. Repeat. But the swimmers, or whatever they were, became more frequent. Tuesday, 10:47 a.m. 3 heads moving in perfect synchronization, parallel to shore. They never came closer than 100 yards, never went further than 300, just patrolled, like they were watching me back. Wednesday, 3:15 p.m. Something large breached about 500 yards out. Not a whale. Wrong shape, too many angles. It was only airborne for maybe 2 seconds, but my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Like trying to understand an optical illusion that keeps shifting. I tried to sketch what I'd seen in my journal, but my hand wouldn't cooperate. Every attempt looked like random scribbles. It was as if my brain refused to retain the memory long enough to transfer it to paper. Thursday, sunset. This was when things got really weird. The fog rolled in fast, thick as cotton. Rule 7. Watch the beach, not the water. But I could hear them. Voices. Singing? No. Not singing. It was like someone trying to imitate human speech without understanding how vocal cords work. The sounds were almost words, almost meaningful, and they were getting closer. The fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. But the sounds, they were circling the tower. Multiple sources, calling and responding to each other in that not-quite language. I gripped the radio, finger hovering over the emergency button. That's when I heard it. Clear as day. My name. Jack. Not my voice. Not any human voice, but unmistakably my name, drawn out in syllables that seemed to echo from every direction at once. I called the emergency number Carl had given me. It rang 17 times before someone picked up. Tower 7 reporting unusual acoustic activity, I said, trying to keep my voice professional. Silence. Then, maintain position. Do not engage. Do not look at the water. Who is this? What's going on? They hung up. That night, I couldn't sleep. I'd rented a small cottage in town, one of those places that smells like mildew and forgotten decades. Around 2 a.m., I heard something that made me grab my phone to record it. Footsteps. Wet footsteps. Going past my house toward the beach, then back, then past again. I peeked through the blinds. The street was empty, but the sidewalk was wet. Seaweed-tangled footprints led from the direction of the beach, past my house, up to the door of the house across the street, then back to the beach. The footprints were wrong too, human-shaped but elongated, the toes too long. And between each set of tracks, drag marks like something with a tail or tentacle had been moving between them. The next morning, the family across the street was gone. Their car was still there. Door unlocked. Coffee still warm on the kitchen table. But they were gone. The police said they probably went for an early morning walk. But I saw those footprints. I know what really happened. That's when I started researching. The town library had newspapers going back to 1910. Seal Point Beach had been a thriving resort town once, popular summer destination. Then, in 1952, 17 people drowned in a single afternoon. Calm day. Experienced swimmers. They just went under and never came up. But the newspaper accounts were strange. Witnesses said the victims didn't act like drowning people. They didn't struggle or call for help. They just swam out into deeper water, as if they were being called. One survivor, a teenage girl who was pulled from the water by her father, kept repeating the same thing. They were so beautiful under the water. They wanted me to stay. The beach reopened in 1961. 23 people drowned that summer. Reopened in 1978. 41 drownings in 3 months. Each reopening brought the same pattern. Normal swimmers would enter the water and simply disappear. Not dramatic drownings. No bodies ever recovered. Just people walking into the waves and never coming back out. The final closure was in '97. The newspaper was vague about details, but I found a microfiche from a San Francisco paper that covered it. An entire scout troop, 14 kids and 3 adults, walked into the water at 11:43 a.m. on July 15th. Witnesses said they moved in perfect unison, like they were being called. They walked until the water was over their heads. Then they just kept walking. None of them tried to swim. None of them struggled. They just walked along the bottom until they disappeared. That's when the state closed the beach permanently. But they kept a lifeguard on duty, always. The records showed continuous employment. 24 guards in 27 years. That seemed like a high turnover rate until I looked closer. Guard number 3, Richard Hayes, 99, missing, last seen walking toward the water at sunset. Guard number 7, Jennifer Wu, 2003, missing. Her tower was found empty mid-shift. Guard number 11, Michael Reeves, 2008, found dead in his cottage, drowned, 3 miles from the ocean, in his living room. Guard number 18, Sarah Martinez, 2015, transferred to psychiatric facility. Would only say they're waiting over and over. I was guard number 24, but there was something else in the records, something that made my blood run cold. Every guard who'd gone missing or died, they'd all kept journals, detailed logs of their observations, and every single journal ended the same way, not with fear or panic or confusion, with understanding. Guard number 12 wrote, "I see now why it has to be this way. The agreement was made long ago. We are not guards, we are witnesses." Guard number 20's final entry. "They showed me tonight the real purpose. It's not about keeping people out of the water. It's about keeping the water from coming inland. And it's working. It's been working for decades, but only because someone watches. Someone always has to watch. Last night changed everything. I need you to understand. I'm not crazy. I have the videos on my phone, the recordings, the proof, though I'm not sure proof matters anymore. It started with the dolphins, real dolphins, a pod of maybe 12 racing south past the beach around 4 p.m. But they weren't playing or hunting. They were fleeing. I've seen dolphins my whole life, and I've never seen them move like that. Pure panic. Then the water changed. The temperature reading jumped from 52 degrees to 78 in less than a minute. The waves stopped. Not calmed. Stopped. The ocean became glass. Perfect dark glass reflecting the late afternoon sun. That's when I saw them clearly for the first time. All of them. They rose from the water slowly. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Human-shaped, but wrong in every way that mattered. Too tall, joints that bent in too many places, skin that shifted between scales and flesh and something that looked like oil. But their faces were the worst part. They were trying so hard to look human, like a child's drawing of a person come to life. Features in almost the right places, but not quite. They stood in the shallows, waist deep, swaying slightly with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the non-existent waves. And they were looking at me, all of them. Hundreds of eyes that weren't quite eyes focused on the tower. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But rule number 4, never leave the tower during shift hours. So I sat there, gripping the arms of my chair, watching them watch me. Then one of them spoke, not with its mouth. The sound came from the water itself, from all around me, inside my head. The contract expires tonight. That's all it said. But suddenly I understood. The lifeguard wasn't here to keep people out of the water. The lifeguard was here to watch, to be a witness, to be an offering, a trade. I still don't fully understand, but I knew that something had been agreed to long ago, and that agreement was ending. As I sat there, paralyzed with understanding, more details became clear. The things in the water weren't malevolent, they weren't evil, they were businesslike. This was a transaction that had been ongoing for decades. The town's continued existence in exchange for what? Observation? Acknowledgement? Recognition that they were here first? The one who had spoken, or the one I think had spoken, gestured toward the shore. More of them were emerging, not just from the water, but from tide pools, from beneath the sand, from crevices in the rocks I'd never noticed before. How long had they been there? How long had they been watching me watch them? At exactly 6 p.m. my shift ended. I stood up on shaking legs, packed my things with trembling hands, and walked down the tower steps. They watched me the entire time. When my feet hit the sand, they started moving. Not toward me, but parallel to shore, matching my pace as I walked to my car. The one that had spoken, or the one I think had spoken, raised something that might have been a hand. In it was an object, small, metallic. It glinted in the dying sunlight, then it threw it. The object landed in the sand at my feet. It was a scout badge. Troop 447. The date on it, my 97. I ran. I got in my car and drove until I couldn't see the ocean anymore. But here's the thing. Here's why I'm recording this at 3 a.m. in a gas station parking lot in Sacramento. The text came through an hour ago, from Carl's number. But Carl, I looked him up. Carl Hendricks was guard number 11, the one who drowned in his living room in 2008. The text said, "Position vacant. Same terms, same agreement. 90 days to find replacement or default to original terms." I looked up the original terms, found them in a town charter from 1891. Before Seal Point was a resort, before it was anything but a fishing village. There was an agreement with those who dwell beneath. The town could fish, could exist, as long as they provided. The word is smudged in every copy, but context suggests it was either witness or sacrifice, maybe both. I've got 90 days to find someone to take my place, someone to sit in that tower and watch, someone to maintain the agreement. Or they come inland, all of them. And based on the footprints I saw, based on what happened to that family, they've already started testing the boundaries. So, if you see a job posting for a high-paying lifeguard position at a beach you've never heard of, don't take it, or do. Someone has to, because the alternative. The sun's coming up now. I should head back. My shift starts in 3 hours. You see, I can't quit. None of us could ever quit. We just had to find our replacement. And guard number 23, Jennifer from Oregon. She found me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But I had to tell someone. Had to make someone curious enough to look into it. Curious enough to maybe apply. The ocean doesn't want us anymore. It never did. We were just borrowing time. And now, the interest is due. If you're still listening, if this story kept you up, If you're lying in bed right now wondering if any of this is real, check the California State Parks website. The job posting will be up soon. $87,000 a year, immediate start. Single applicant needed. Just remember, some beaches aren't meant for swimming. Some contracts aren't meant to be broken. And some things in the deep are better left unwatched. But someone has to watch. Someone always has to watch. The question is, will it be you? Recording ends. Wait, before you go, did you hear that? That sound in the background of this recording? Like waves, but I'm 3 hours from the ocean. Let me play it back. No, that's not possible. They can't be here. They can't. If you're listening to this, check your windows. Check them now. And whatever you do, don't answer if someone knocks. Especially if they're wet. Especially if they're smiling. Especially if their eyes have too many colors. The contract isn't just about Seal Point anymore. They know about the lie. They know about you. And they're coming to make sure the story spreads. To make sure someone, anyone, takes the job. Don't let them in. Don't look at them directly. And whatever you do, don't go to Seal Point Beach. Unless you have to. Unless you're the kind of person who can't resist a mystery. The kind who needs to know if this is real. The kind who's already looking up Seal Point on Google Maps even though I warned you not to. Yeah, I thought so. I was that person too. See you soon. The tower's waiting. Story number 3. Listen, if you're still awake at this hour, scrolling through videos trying to find something to help you drift off, I've got something that might interest you. But I'm warning you now. Once you hear this, you might find yourself checking the comments to see if anyone else has experienced what I'm about to tell you. You might even find yourself hitting that subscribe button, just to make sure you don't miss the explanation I promise to give, eventually. My name's Marcus Thompson, and last Tuesday, I broke one of the unwritten rules of the Florida Everglades, the kind of rule that airboat captains whisper about in dive bars along the Tamiami Trail, but never write down, never record, never officially acknowledge. But before I tell you which rule I broke, and what happened when I did, let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how some places just feel different after dark? Not scary, exactly. Just aware? Like the darkness itself is watching? That's the Everglades after sunset. And that's when the rules matter most. Now, the story begins. The morning I inherited Uncle Roy's airboat tour business, the lawyer handed me 3 things. A key ring, heavy with brass and rust. The deed to a weather-beaten shack on the edge of the Everglades. And a laminated card with 7 rules typed on it. Your uncle was very specific, the lawyer said, sliding his glasses up his nose. He said you needed to read these before you took your first tour out. I almost laughed. Uncle Roy had always been eccentric. The kind of guy who'd cross himself before starting his truck and wouldn't eat catfish on Thursdays. I figured this was just more of his superstitious nonsense. The rules were simple enough. 1. Never run tours after 8 p.m. 2. Always keep fresh water in the red cooler. 3. Count your passengers at every stop. 4. Don't acknowledge the lights that aren't there. 5. If you hear singing, turn back. The old chickie hut is off limits. Trust what the gators avoid. Seriously? I asked the lawyer. He shrugged. Your uncle insisted. Said every captain who's lasted more than a season follows them. I pocketed the card and forgot about it. I had a business to learn, bills to pay, a life to rebuild after my divorce. Sarah had taken everything except my truck and my pride, and barely left me those. This airboat business was my chance to start over. The shack, calling it rustic would be generous, sat at the end of a gravel road, about 15 miles southwest of Homestead. The nearest neighbor was a bait shop 3 miles away. The office consisted of a desk held together with duct tape, a CB radio that looked older than me, and a wall covered in faded photographs of tourists holding baby alligators. Behind the shack, 5 airboats sat in various states of repair. Only 2 looked seaworthy, or swamp-worthy, I guess. The newest one, painted bright yellow with Captain Roy's Glades Tours on the side, became my primary vessel. My first week, I ran simple tours, mostly retirees from Miami wanting to see gators and birds. Easy money. I'd cruise them through the sawgrass prairies, point out some wildlife, tell them about the ecosystem. The usual tourist stuff. I even started to enjoy it. The wind in my face, the endless sky, the way the marsh grass whispered secrets to itself. Tommy Bautista, who ran the tour outfit 2 miles north, stopped by on Friday afternoon. He was a third-generation Glades captain, skin like leather and eyes that had seen too much sun, or maybe just too much. "Heard Roy's nephew took over," he said, accepting the beer I offered. "You keeping to the rules?" "The rules?" I pulled out the laminated card. "These things?" Tommy's expression darkened. "Those aren't things, boy. Those are insurance." "Against what?" He was quiet for a long moment, peeling the label off his beer bottle. "You know the Everglades is only 50 years old as a national park, but it's been here for 5,000 years. Maybe more. The Calusa Indians, the Seminoles, they all knew things about this place. Things that didn't make it into the guidebooks. Come on, Tommy." "I'm serious." He leaned forward. "You ever wonder why Roy lasted 43 years out here without a single serious incident? Why his customers always came back? Why the gators never bothered his boats? Lucky?" Tommy snorted. "Luck runs out, Marcus. Following the rules doesn't." He finished his beer and stood to leave. At the door, he paused. "That card Roy left you? Other captains would kill for it. Most of us had to learn the rules the hard way, through close calls and worse. Roy wrote them down for you because he cared. Don't disrespect that gift." That night, I studied the rules again by lamplight. Outside, the Everglades sang its nighttime chorus. Frogs, insects, the occasional splash of something hunting in the dark water. Rule number 1 seemed like common sense. Running an airboat at night was dangerous anyway. The others, though, don't acknowledge the lights that aren't there. What lights? Tuesday arrived with the kind of humid heat that makes you regret living in Florida. By noon, my shirt was soaked through, and I'd already run 2 tours. The afternoon booking was a group of college kids from University of Miami. Marine biology students, their professor said when she called. "We're studying bioluminescence in freshwater environments," she explained over the phone. "We need to be out after dark to collect samples. I'll pay triple your usual rate." Triple rate. That would cover my boat repairs and then some. "I don't usually run night tours," I said, thinking of rule number 1. "We'll be done by 9, she promised. 9:30 at the latest. I looked at the stack of bills on my desk, at the photo of Sarah and me in happier times that I still hadn't thrown away. "All right, be here at 7. They showed up right on time. 6 students and Professor Lisa Chen, a serious woman with her black hair pulled back tight in expensive-looking equipment cases. The students were typical college kids, all jokes and energy, taking selfies with the airboat before we even left the dock. "Stay seated while we're moving," I told them, running through my safety speech. "Keep your hands inside the boat. And if I tell you to do something, you do it immediately, no questions. The Everglades isn't Disneyland." We headed out as the sun started its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The students took water samples at 3 different spots, carefully labeling vials and making notes. Normal stuff. Educational, safe. It was 8:15 when things changed. "Captain Thompson," Professor Chen called from the middle of the boat. "We need to go about 2 miles further west. There's a specific algae concentration we're tracking. It'll be fully dark by the time we get back, I said. "We have headlamps, and you know these waters, right?" I did. That was the problem. 2 miles west would put us near the old Chickie hut, the one from rule number 6, but I'd already broken rule 1 by being out after 8. What was one more? "All right," I said, "but we make it quick." The airboat roared across the darkening water, its spotlight cutting through the growing shadows. The students had gone quiet. That happened sometimes when people realized how vast and wild this place really was. No cell service, no roads, just water and grass and things that had lived here since before humans thought to write things down. We reached the sampling spot just as the last light faded from the sky. The students worked quickly, their headlamps making them look like giant fireflies hovering over the dark water. I kept the spotlight moving, watching for gators. That's when I saw it, or didn't see it, I guess. About 100 yards away, where the old Chickie hut stood on its stilts, there was nothing. Not darkness, exactly. Something else. A space where light just stopped, like someone had cut a hole in reality itself. One of the students, Mike, I think, pointed. "Hey, what's that light over there?" I followed his finger and saw it, a soft green glow hovering about 3 feet above the water, near that strange absence of light. "Probably swamp gas," I said, remembering rule number 4. Don't acknowledge the lights that aren't there. "Swamp gas doesn't move like that," Mike said. He was right. The light was drifting toward us, slow and deliberate. "Everyone in the boat," I ordered. "Now." But Mike was already leaning over the side, his phone out, trying to record the light. "This is incredible. It's like a will-o'-the-wisp. Professor Chen, are you seeing this?" The light stopped about 50 feet away. Then another appeared beside it, then another. "Mike, get in the boat." My voice was sharper than I intended. "Just a second." He leaned further. That's when we heard the singing. It wasn't quite human. The melody was wrong. Notes that shouldn't exist. At least not in any scale I knew. But it was beautiful in the way a car crash is beautiful. You can't look away even though you know you should. Rule number 5, if you hear singing, turn back. "We're leaving!" I shouted, firing up the airboat. The students scrambled to their seats except Mike, who was still filming. The lights were all around us now, dozens of them, forming a slowly tightening circle. The singing grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the water itself. "Mike!" Professor Chen grabbed his arm. "Get!" He tumbled into the water. For a moment, everything stopped. The singing, the lights, even the insects went silent. Then Mike screamed. I've heard a lot of sounds in my life. Sarah crying when she told me about the affair. My dad's last breath in the hospital. But nothing like this. It wasn't pain, it was recognition. Like he'd suddenly understood something terrible. I yanked him back into the boat with strength I didn't know I had. He was ice cold and shaking, his eyes wide and unfocused. "The rules," he whispered. "There are so many rules, and we're breaking them all." The lights surged toward us. I gunned the engine, spinning the boat so hard 2 students nearly flew out. We raced through the darkness, the spotlight barely penetrating the black water ahead. Behind us, the lights followed, keeping pace easily. "What are those things?" someone screamed. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because in the spotlight's reflection on the water, I saw something that the rules hadn't prepared me for. The lights weren't floating above the water. They were eyes, and the things they belonged to were massive. We made it back to the dock, but barely. Mike was unconscious by the time we arrived, his skin so cold Professor Chen thought he was going into shock. The other students were crying or praying or both. I called 911, told them a student had fallen in the water and needed help. I didn't mention the lights, or the singing, or what I'd seen in the reflection. The paramedics took Mike away, and Professor Chen rode with him after ensuring I had her insurance information. The other students dispersed quickly, eager to be anywhere but near the water. Within an hour, I was alone at the dock, sitting on the hood of my truck, trying to make sense of what had happened. Tommy Bautista's truck pulled up around midnight. "Heard you had some trouble," he said, climbing out with 2 cups of coffee. "How did you?" "Scanner. Plus the whole swamp knows when someone breaks the rules that bad." He handed me a coffee and leaned against the truck beside me. "The kid gonna make it?" "I don't know. He was changed, like something had touched his mind." Tommy nodded slowly. "That happens sometimes. When people see things they shouldn't. Their brains try to make sense of it, but they can't. It's like trying to download the whole internet on a flip phone." "What were those things, Tommy?" He was quiet for a long time, sipping his coffee. "You really want to know?" "Yes. No, you don't. But I'll tell you anyway." He pulled out a cigarette, lit it with shaking hands. "The Everglades. It's not just a swamp, it's a boundary between our world and somewhere else. The Calusa knew it. The Seminoles know it. And those things you saw, they're the reason for the rules. That doesn't explain anything." "Sure it does. Think about it. Every culture has stories about things in the water. Sirens, kelpies, kalupalik. You think they're all just making up the same story?" He took a long drag. "The rules keep us from attracting their attention. Keep us boring, uninteresting, safe. And when we break the rules, we become interesting." A splash in the water made us both jump. "Just a gator, probably. Maybe." "The old chickie hut," I said. "Rule 6. What's special about it?" Tommy's expression darkened. "That's where it's thinnest, the boundary. Your Uncle Roy, he went there once. Came back different. Took him years to seem normal again, and even then," he shrugged. "Why do you think he wrote down the rules? He didn't want anyone else to pay the price he paid for learning them." "Will they come back, those things?" "Not if you follow the rules from now on. They have short memories, mostly, like fish. Unless," he paused, "unless what? Unless someone breaks too many rules at once. Or the same rule too many times. Then they remember. Then they get persistent." My phone buzzed. A text from Professor Chen. "Mike is stable but unresponsive. Doctors can't explain his condition. His body temperature won't rise above 85 degrees. I showed Tommy the text. "He'll come back," Tommy said. "Eventually. But he won't be the same. People who hear the singing never are." He finished his coffee and stood. "You got lucky tonight, Marcus. They could have taken all of you, could have pulled your boat under and made it look like an accident. 7 college kids and a tour guide lost in the Everglades. Tragic, but not unheard of. Why didn't they?" Tommy looked at me for a long moment. "Because you got them back to dock. You didn't freeze, didn't panic. You remembered you were a captain, and captains protect their passengers. The Everglades respects that. It's one of the unwritten rules. Courage in the face of the impossible earns you a pass. Once." He started walking to his truck, then stopped. "Oh, and Marcus? That red cooler your uncle mentioned in Rule 2, keep fresh water in it, not for drinking. It's for pouring a line around your boat if you ever get stuck out there at night. They can't cross running water. Don't ask me why, it's just how they are." After Tommy left, I sat there until dawn, watching the water. Occasionally, I thought I saw lights in the distance, but I didn't acknowledge them. Rule 4. When the sun finally rose, I went into the shack and pulled out a notebook. At the top of the first page I wrote, "Additional rules learned the hard way." Under that, I wrote, "The old chickie hut is where the boundary is thinnest. They have eyes that look like lights. Running water keeps them back. Courage earns you 1 pass. Those who hear the singing are forever changed." I had a feeling this list would grow. 3 days passed. I canceled all my tours, told people I was doing maintenance on the boats. Really, I was trying to decide if I could do this job, if I could follow the rules, if I could live with what I now knew lived in the water. Mike woke up on the 4th day. Professor Chen called to tell me. "He's different," she said carefully. "The doctors say there's no brain damage, but he keeps talking about rules for everything. How to walk, how to breathe, how to blink. He says he can see them all now, written in the air. Can I visit him? He asked for you, actually. Said he needs to tell you something." I drove to Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami that afternoon. Mike was in the psychiatric ward, a precaution, the nurses said. He looked normal enough, until you saw his eyes. They reflected light differently now, like a cat's. "Captain Thompson," he said when I entered. His voice was flat, emotionless. "You need to know something." "What's that, Mike?" "They're not done with you." He tilted his head at an unnatural angle. "When I was in the water, when they had me, I could hear them thinking. They're old, Captain, older than the swamp, older than the land. And they're curious about you now." "Why?" "Because you knew the rules but broke them anyway. That makes you interesting. Most people who break the rules don't know they exist. You did, that's..." He paused, searching for a word. "Unprecedented. Tommy said they'd leave me alone if I followed the rules from now on." Mike laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. "Tommy doesn't know what I know, what they showed me." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They're going to test you, Captain. Push you. See how many rules you're willing to break, and when you break enough..." He sat back. "You'll join Uncle Roy." "What do you mean, join Uncle Roy? He's dead." "Is he?" Mike's eyes reflected the fluorescent lights. "Or is he just following different rules now?" I left the hospital with more questions than answers. That night, I sat in the shack, staring at the photo wall. All those tourists, all those successful tours. In 43 years, Uncle Roy had never had a serious incident. The perfect safety record. I pulled down one of the older photos, one from maybe 30 years ago. Uncle Roy stood next to his airboat, a group of tourists around him. Normal, except I looked closer. His eyes. In the photo, they reflected the camera flash in a way that looked familiar. Just like Mike's eyes now. I went through more photos chronologically. The change was subtle, happening over years, but it was there. Uncle Roy's eyes gradually becoming more reflective, more cat-like. And in the last photos, taken just months before his heart attack, they glowed slightly, even in daylight. My phone rang. Unknown number. "Marcus Thompson?" The voice was official, clinical. "Yes? This is Dr. Morrison at Jackson Memorial. I'm calling about Michael Sawyer. He's missing." "Missing?" "He walked out of his room an hour ago. Security footage shows him leaving the building, but he doesn't appear on any cameras after that. He just vanished. We thought you should know, since you were his last visitor." I hung up and grabbed the keys to the airboat. I knew where Mike had gone. The same place Uncle Roy used to go when the calling got too strong. The old chickie hut. I reached the dock as the sun was setting. That liminal time when day surrenders to night and the rules start to matter. The red cooler sat in the boat, filled with fresh water, just like Rule 2 demanded. I also brought a flashlight, a flare gun, and a machete. Not that any of them would help against what lived in the water, but they made me feel better. The journey to the chickie hut took 20 minutes in fading light. I counted every second, aware I was approaching Rule 1's deadline. But I had to know. Had to understand what had happened to Uncle Roy, what was happening to Mike. The chickie hut stood on weathered stilts, its thatched roof partially collapsed. In the dying light it looked abandoned, forgotten. But as darkness fell, I saw them. Lights moving inside. Not electric lights, the other kind. Mike sat on the platform, his feet dangling over the water. He didn't look up when I approached. "You shouldn't have come, Captain. What is this place? A doorway, a threshold, a place where rules are written." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were fully green now, glowing like deep-sea creatures. "Your Uncle Roy came here every month for the last 10 years of his life. They taught him things, showed him how to keep the balance." "What balance?" "Between their world and ours, someone has to maintain it. Someone who knows both sets of rules." He stood, moving with an unnatural fluidity. "Roy chose you, Captain. Trained you without you knowing. And now that he's gone," the singing started again. Soft at first, then building. But this time, I could almost understand it. Almost make out words in a language that predated human speech. "Join us," Mike said. But it wasn't really Mike anymore. It was something wearing Mike's shape. "Learn the true rules, the deep rules, the ones that keep both worlds safe. And if I refuse?" The lights in the water multiplied. Hundreds of green eyes watching, waiting. Then the boundary weakens. Things cross over that shouldn't, both ways. He gestured to the water. "They're not evil, Captain. They're just different. And difference without understanding leads to disaster." I thought about Uncle Roy, spending 43 years keeping people safe. Thought about the rules he'd written down, the gift Tommy had called them. Thought about Mike, brilliant and young, now transformed into something between worlds. "What happened to Uncle Roy?" I asked. "Really?" Mike smiled, and for a moment, he looked almost human again. "He became what he needed to become. What someone always needs to become. A translator between worlds, a keeper of rules, a guardian of the boundary. Is he down there? He's everywhere. Water touches in the Everglades now, part of the system, part of the balance." Mike extended his hand. "The question is, will you help maintain what he built, or will you let it fall apart?" I looked at his hand, at the water, at the lights that weren't really lights. Then I made my choice. I took Mike's hand. The moment our skin touched, I understood. The rules weren't restrictions. They were a treaty. An agreement between our world and theirs, negotiated over millennia, written in instinct and tradition and passed down through stories and warnings. The Everglades wasn't just a swamp. It was a membrane between realities, and someone had to make sure it didn't tear. Mike led me into the chickie hut, and inside was impossible. Larger than outside, filled with a green light that came from everywhere and nowhere. The walls were covered in rules, thousands of them, written in every language that had ever existed and some that hadn't. "This is what Uncle Roy protected," Mike said. "This is what needs a guardian." I saw my uncle's additions, written in his careful handwriting. Rules about airboats and tourists, about safety and respect, about keeping both worlds separate but acknowledged. "How long?" I asked. "As long as you can." Roy lasted 43 years. The one before him, 20, before that. Mike shrugged. The Seminoles had their own guardians. The Calusa before them. There's always been someone. "And you?" "I'm something else now, a bridge, like Roy became." He moved to the wall, running his fingers over the rules. "I can't go back to what I was, but I can help you understand what you need to be." We stayed in the chickie hut until dawn, Mike teaching me the deeper rules, how to read the water's moods, how to sense when the boundary was thin, how to strengthen it with rituals that looked like routine maintenance but were really ancient rites. When the sun rose, the hut was just a ruin again. Mike was gone. Or maybe he was in the water, part of it now, like Uncle Roy. I took the boat back to the dock, my eyes already starting to ache from what they'd seen. Tommy was waiting for me. "So," he said, "you know now. You knew all along." I suspected. Roy trained me too, years ago, but I didn't have the strength for it. The will, you do. He handed me a cup of coffee. "The rules you have, the 7 Roy wrote down, that's just the beginning. The training wheels, the real rules." He tapped his temple. "Those you'll learn as you go. How many guardians are there? Every swamp, every boundary water has at least one. We don't meet, don't organize, we just maintain. Keep the balance. Keep both worlds safe." I looked at my reflection in the coffee. My eyes were still normal, mostly. What happens if I walk away? Then someone else gets chosen, probably violently. The boundary doesn't like being unguarded. Things leak through. People disappear. Eventually, someone figures out the rules again, but he shrugged. A lot of damage gets done in the meantime. I thought about Mike, transformed. About Uncle Roy, part of the water now. About all the tourists who'd never know how close they'd come to something ancient and impossible. "I'll do it," I said. Tommy smiled sadly. "I know. Roy knew too. It's why he left you the business. Not just the boats and the shack, the real business, the important one. That was a week ago. I run tours again now. Follow the 7 rules religiously, and the dozen others I've learned since. The tourists see alligators and birds, and sometimes manatees. They take their pictures and buy their t-shirts and go home with stories about the wild Everglades. They don't see the lights that aren't there. Don't hear the singing that comes from deeper than the water. Don't notice when I pour water from the red cooler in specific patterns that have nothing to do with cleaning and everything to do with protection. Sometimes, late at night, I hear Mike's voice in the wind, or Uncle Roy's in the creaking of the dock. They're not gone, just changed. Part of something bigger. Part of the balance. My eyes are starting to change too. I can see it in the mirror. That slight reflection, like a cat's. In maybe 10 years, it'll be obvious. In 20, undeniable. In 40, well, Uncle Roy lasted 43 years before he became something else. But someone has to do it. Someone has to stand between the tourists and the truth. Someone has to maintain the treaty, honor the rules, keep the boundary strong. Might as well be me. After all, I inherited the business. So now you know, there are rules in the Everglades. Rules that keep you safe. Rules that keep things separate that should stay separate. And if you ever take an airboat tour in South Florida, and your captain seems oddly insistent about being back before dark, about staying away from certain areas, about not acknowledging things that might or might not be there, thank them. They're following the rules. And the rules are all that stand between our world and theirs, between the normal and what waits in the water. Sweet dreams, if you can manage them. And hey, if you're still awake, if this story has you checking your windows, wondering about the water in your area, drop a comment below. Tell me about the rules in your town, the ones nobody talks about, the ones everybody follows, because every place has them. Every single place. And if you want to hear more about what happens when the rules get broken, or when new ones need to be written, hit that subscribe button. I've got more stories from the captains, more tales from the boundary waters, more truths that sound like fiction, until you realize they're not. The Everglades remembers everything, you see. Everything, and sometimes it shares. Story number 4. The coffee was still burning my tongue when I heard the first whisper. Now, before you click away thinking this is just another ghost story, let me tell you something. I've worked grain elevators in Kansas for 15 years. 15 years of 5:15 a.m. starts. 15 years of knowing every creak, every groan, every mechanical symphony these metal giants make. So when something doesn't belong, you notice. But what I heard that Tuesday morning in October, that changed everything I thought I knew about the prairie, about grain, and about what lives in the spaces between our understanding. The story you're about to hear is real, every word, and by the end, you might find yourself questioning what you hear in your own quiet moments. My name is Jake Morrison, and the Hartwell Grain Elevator has been my second home since I was 23. It's one of those towering concrete monuments you see dotting the Kansas landscape, standing like a sentinel against the endless sky. From the highway, it looks simple enough, just another agricultural landmark. But up close, it's a cathedral of steel and dust and echoing chambers that seem to go on forever. That Tuesday started like any other. 5:15 a.m. Sharp, I pulled my Ford pickup into the gravel lot. The autumn air had that bite to it. You know the one. That crisp promise of winter that makes your breath visible and your fingers ache inside your work gloves. The sun hadn't even thought about rising yet, and the only light came from the single bulb hanging over the main entrance. I remember thinking how quiet it was. Too quiet, maybe. But I pushed that thought away. October mornings in Kansas are supposed to be quiet. Peaceful, even. The ritual never changed. Coffee first, always coffee first. Then check the moisture readings, inspect the conveyor systems, and start the daily grain flow operations. Routine, predictable, safe. I was on my second cup when I heard it. A whisper. So soft I almost convinced myself it was the wind finding its way through the metal framework. But here's the thing about grain elevators. They don't whisper. They roar, they clank, they hum with mechanical purpose. They don't murmur. Help! The word was barely audible, floating down from somewhere in the upper chambers. I froze, coffee cup halfway to my lips. The building was empty except for me. Had to be. I'd unlocked the doors myself. I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" Nothing. Just the familiar drone of the ventilation system and the distant rumble of grain settling in the silos. But I knew what I'd heard, and in 15 years of working alone in these early morning hours, I'd never heard anything like it. The rest of that first day passed normally. My coworker Danny Reeves showed up at 7, and we fell into our usual routine. I almost mentioned the whisper, almost. But Danny was the kind of guy who'd never let you live down hearing voices in the grain, so I kept it to myself. That was my first mistake. Wednesday morning, 5:15 a.m. Same routine, same coffee, same empty building. Except this time, I was listening, really listening. It came again at 5:32 a.m. I know the exact time because I'd been checking my watch every few minutes. Waiting, dreading maybe. Help, us. 2 voices this time, overlapping like an echo that doesn't quite match the original sound. One seemed to come from the east silo, the other from the west. Both from high up in the storage chambers where no one could possibly be. My hands were shaking as I set down my coffee. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't the building settling or the wind playing tricks. This was something else. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the east silo ladder. Those silos stretch up nearly 200 feet, with inspection catwalks every 40 feet or so. The beam of my light cut through the dusty air as I climbed, each rung taking me further from the comfort of the ground level and deeper into the vertical maze of the grain storage system. At the first catwalk, I stopped and listened. Nothing but my own breathing and the metallic groan of the structure around me. The smell of grain dust was stronger here, that sweet, earthy scent that gets into your clothes and stays there for days. I climbed higher. At the second level, something made me pause. The grain below, it looked different somehow. disturbed, like something had been moving through it, creating patterns in the surface. But that was impossible. The grain had been sitting undisturbed for weeks. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing in the hollow chamber. The silence that followed felt expectant, like the building itself was holding its breath. I climbed back down, my legs unsteady and my mind racing. When Danny arrived that morning, I was already 3 cups deep in coffee and jumping at every sound. "You look like hell, Jake," he said, hanging up his jacket. "Everything okay?" I wanted to tell him. Wanted to share the weight of what I'd heard. But instead, I just shrugged and said, "Didn't sleep well. Storm kept me up." There hadn't been any storm. Thursday morning brought rain. A cold, steady drizzle that drummed against the metal walls and made the whole building feel more enclosed, more intimate. I arrived early, 5 o'clock a.m. instead of 5:15. If these voices were real, if they were coming at a specific time, I wanted to be ready. The whispers started at 5:28 a.m. But this time was different. "Help us. We can't get out." The voices were clearer now, more desperate. And they seemed to be coming from inside the grain itself, like the wheat was somehow carrying the sound, amplifying it, giving it shape and purpose. I stood there in the break room, coffee forgotten, listening to what sounded like multiple voices, men and women, young and old, all calling out from inside the silos, all trapped, all frightened. And that's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. They weren't just random voices. They were speaking in patterns, taking turns, like they were having a conversation with each other, and maybe with me. Friday morning, I came prepared. Voice recorder app on my phone, notepad, pen. If I was going crazy, at least I'd have documentation. If I wasn't, well, then I needed proof. The voices started at 5:26 a.m., earlier than before. Jake, my name, clear as a bell, floating down from the west silo. My hands went numb, and the phone nearly slipped from my grip. "Jake, can you hear us?" I fumbled with the recorder, finally getting it started. "Yes," I whispered back. "I can hear you. Who are you?" The response came immediately, overlapping voices creating a chorus of desperation. "Workers, like you, trapped, so long. In the grain, in the walls, in the dust. Can't leave, can't move on." I was recording everything, my heart hammering against my ribs. "When did this happen? How long have you been here?" "Different times. Decades. Some longer. Accidents, falls, buried alive. The grain. It holds us, keeps us." My legs gave out, and I sank into the nearest chair. The implications were staggering. Grain elevator accidents. They happen, more often than people like to admit. Workers fall into silos, get buried in grain avalanches, disappear into the mechanical systems. Most of the time they're found. But sometimes they're not. "How many of you are there?" I asked. The silence stretched out so long I thought they'd gone. Then a single voice, older, tired. "Too many, son. Too many." When Danny arrived that morning, I was a wreck. Shaking hands, pale skin, dark circles under my eyes. He took one look at me and frowned. "Jake, what the hell is going on? You've been weird all week." I showed him the recording, played it back on my phone, watching his face change from skepticism to confusion to something approaching fear. That can't be real," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Come in early with me Monday," I said. 5:15 a.m., hear it for yourself." He agreed, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. The same doubt I'd been carrying all week. That weekend, I did research. Dug through old newspaper archives, safety reports, anything I could find about accidents at the Hartwell facility. What I discovered made my skin crawl. 17 documented deaths over the past 60 years. 17 workers who'd died in various accidents, falls, equipment malfunctions, grain entrapments. But here's what made my blood freeze. Only 12 bodies had ever been recovered. 5 workers, 5 human beings, had simply vanished into the grain storage system. Presumed dead, but never found. Never properly laid to rest. And according to the dates, they died at different times spanning 6 decades. Monday morning, 5:15 a.m. Danny was there, coffee in hand, trying to look casual but failing miserably. We sat in the break room, waiting, listening. 5:25 a.m. came and went. Nothing. 5:30 a.m. Silence. Danny started to relax, a smug smile creeping across his face. "Jake, I think maybe you should talk to someone. This job, sometimes the isolation gets to people." That's when they spoke. Danny. The voice was so clear, so close, that Danny jumped and spilled coffee all over his shirt. His face went white as paper. "Danny Reeves, from Selena. Your father, Robert, worked here too." Danny's coffee cup shattered on the floor. That's impossible. My dad worked here in the 70s. How could you?" "He's here too, Danny. He's been waiting." What happened next? I still get chills thinking about it. Danny's tough guy facade crumbled completely. Tears started streaming down his face as a familiar voice, older, weathered, but unmistakably paternal, drifted down from the silos. "Son, Danny, is that you? Dad?" Danny's voice broke. "Dad, we thought you died in Vietnam." "No, boy. I died right here. October 15th, 1977. Grain avalanche in Silo 3 never made it home." I watched Danny fall apart. Watched years of wondering and hoping and grieving crash down on him all at once. His father hadn't abandoned the family to run off and start a new life. He hadn't died in some foreign war. He'd died here, trapped and forgotten in the grain that fed America. The other voices joined in, each one sharing their story. Martha Wellington, who fell from the catwalk in 1962. James Rodriguez, caught in the conveyor system in 1989. Sarah Chen, who suffocated in a grain entrapment just 5 years ago. All of them trapped. All of them unable to move on because their bodies were never properly recovered, never properly mourned. "What do you need?" I asked. "How can we help you?" The answer came from multiple voices, harmonizing in a way that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "Find us. Let us rest. Let us go home." Danny and I spent the next week doing exactly that. We brought in ground-penetrating radar, hired a specialized recovery team, worked with the local authorities. One by one, we found them, buried in the grain, tangled in the machinery, lost in the forgotten corners of the storage system. One by one, we brought them home. The voices stopped after we recovered the last body. Sarah Chen, found in Silo 4 at a depth of 30 feet. The silence that followed wasn't empty, though. It was peaceful, complete. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. Just last Tuesday, exactly 1 month after we laid Sarah to rest, I heard a new voice. Young, scared, recent. "Help, please, can anyone hear me?" And I realized, the grain elevators of Kansas hold more secrets than we'll ever know, more voices than we'll ever hear, because somewhere out there, in the endless expanse of prairie grain storage, someone else has gone missing. Someone else needs to be found. But the recovery operation, that's where things got truly unsettling. And I mean unsettling in ways I never expected. The specialized recovery team arrived on a Wednesday. 3 professionals from Wichita who dealt with agricultural accident recovery, a grim specialty that exists because of how often workers disappear into grain storage systems. Their leader, a weathered woman named Carol Martinez, had been doing this work for 22 years. "We've seen this before," she told Danny and me as her team set up their equipment. Grain storage facilities. They're like icebergs. Most of the structure is hidden. Bodies can shift, settle, get moved by grain flow over decades. What she didn't say, what none of us expected, was how the voices would react to the recovery efforts. They started speaking the moment Carol's team powered up the ground-penetrating radar. "No, not yet. We're not ready." The voices were panicked now, desperate in a way they'd never been before. Like the prospect of being found was somehow more terrifying than being lost. "Wait. Please wait. Something is wrong." I exchanged glances with Danny. This wasn't the relief we'd expected. These weren't the grateful voices of spirits ready to find peace. "They're scared," Danny whispered. "Why are they scared of being found?" Carol's radar operator, a young guy named Marcus, suddenly stopped what he was doing. His face had gone pale, and he was staring at his screen with an expression I'd never seen on a professional's face before. "Carol," he called out, his voice tight. "You need to see this." The radar image showed something that made no sense. Bodies, yes, but not where they should be. Not scattered randomly through the grain storage system as we'd expected. They were arranged, deliberately, in patterns. "That's," Carol started, then stopped, shook her head. "That's not possible. Bodies don't arrange themselves." But there they were on the screen. 17 distinct shapes. Not just the 5 missing workers, but all 17 documented deaths, arranged in what looked almost like a circle. A ritual pattern. Deep in the grain storage system, positioned with geometric precision that defied every natural law of how bodies settle in granular material. "The grain moved us," came the whispered explanation from above. "Over time, it moved us together, made us into something, connected." "Connected how?" I called out, my voice echoing in the chamber. "We share everything now. Memories, pain, hope. We became more than we were." Carol's team worked for 3 days extracting the first body, James Rodriguez, who'd died in 1989. But when they brought him up, when they laid him out in the makeshift morgue they'd set up in the facility's office space, he was perfectly preserved. Not mummified, not decayed, preserved as if he'd died yesterday, despite being buried in grain for over 30 years. "This doesn't happen," Carol said, her professional composure finally cracking. "Bodies don't. This violates everything I know about decomposition, about grain storage chemistry, about everything." But James Rodriguez looked like he was sleeping. His work clothes were intact. His face was peaceful, unmarked by time or decay. Even his hair looked freshly cut. The voices fell silent after that, completely silent, as if the removal of James had somehow severed their connection to our world. Danny and I worked late that night, trying to process what we'd seen. The silence felt wrong now, heavier than the voices had ever been, like we'd broken something fundamental. "Maybe we should stop," Danny said around midnight. "Maybe they don't want to be found." I was about to agree when my phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "The grain remembers everything. It holds more than bodies. Look deeper." I showed Danny the message. "Did you send this?" He shook his head. "Jake, who even has your number besides me and Carol's team?" Before I could answer, another message appeared. "Silo 7, the old one. Never been opened since 1954. Look there." Silo 7. I'd never heard of a Silo 7. The Hartwell facility only had 6 silos. I'd worked here for 15 years. I knew every inch of this place. But the next morning, when Carol's team arrived, I asked her about it. Silo 7? She consulted her facility blueprints, frowned. According to these original construction documents, there is a Silo 7, sealed off in 1954 after some kind of accident, but it's not on any of the current facility maps. Where is it? She pointed to a section of the building I'd walked past thousands of times, an area I'd always assumed was just thick wall construction. Behind that wall, it's been sealed for 70 years. Getting permission to open Silo 7 took 2 days of arguing with facility management, county officials, and insurance companies. But Carol's team had the authority to investigate any part of the facility that might contain human remains. They brought in concrete cutting equipment, industrial saws, the kind of tools you use when you're not just opening a door, you're breaking into a tomb. The wall was 3 feet thick, solid concrete reinforced with steel beams. Whatever they'd sealed inside Silo 7, they'd never intended for it to be opened again. When the saw finally broke through, the smell hit us first. Not decay, something else. Sweet, organic, like fermented grain, but with an undertone that made my stomach turn. "Everyone step back," Carol ordered. "Let me check air quality first." But as she approached the opening with her detection equipment, the voices returned, all at once, louder than they'd ever been. "Don't open it. Seal it back up. Some things should stay buried." The urgency in their voices was terrifying. These spirits who'd begged for release, who'd wanted to be found and laid to rest, they were screaming at us to stop. Carol's equipment beeped. Air quality is strange. Elevated humidity, unusual chemical signatures, but nothing immediately toxic. She looked at me. "It's your call, Jake. This is your facility." I thought about walking away, thought about sealing the wall back up and pretending we'd never found Silo 7. But I also thought about that text message, about the voice I'd heard just last week, the new one, the scared one. "We go in," I said. The interior of Silo 7 was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The walls were covered in grain, but not stored grain. Grain that had somehow grown there, embedding itself into the concrete, creating organic patterns that looked almost like writing. Like the grain itself had developed its own language over 70 years of isolation. At the bottom of the silo, we found them. Not bodies this time. Something else. Cocoons. Dozens of them. Made from woven grain stalks and some kind of organic material I couldn't identify. Each one roughly human-sized. Each one pulsing gently, like it contained something alive. "What the hell are those?" Danny whispered. Carol's voice was barely audible. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like this." One of the cocoons was different from the others. Newer, still damp with whatever process had created it. And from inside, faint scratching sounds. "Help," came a muffled voice. "Please, I can't move." The new voice, the one I'd heard last week. It wasn't a ghost at all. It was someone trapped inside that cocoon. Someone alive. I grabbed a knife from Carol's equipment and started cutting. The material was tough, fibrous, but it parted under the blade. Inside, a man, middle-aged, wearing work clothes I didn't recognize. His eyes were open, staring, but he seemed unable to move. Paralyzed. "How long?" I asked him. "How long have you been in there?" 3 days, he gasped. "Maybe 4. I was working the overnight shift at the Morrison facility, 20 miles east of here. I fell into one of their silos, and when I woke up, I was here in this thing." "The Morrison facility?" Carol checked her maps. That doesn't exist. There's no grain elevator at that location." But I knew better now. I was starting to understand what we were dealing with. "How many grain elevators are there really in Kansas?" I asked Carol. She looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, how many are on the official maps versus how many actually exist. How many facilities are there that aren't documented, aren't regulated, aren't supposed to be there? Carol's silence was answer enough. The cocoons weren't just preservation chambers. They were some kind of transport system, the grain storage network of Kansas. All those towering silos scattered across the prairie, they were connected, linked in ways that defied geography, defied physics. And something was using them to move people, to collect them. We need to cut them all open, I said. All of these cocoons, there might be more people alive in there. But as I approached the nearest cocoon with my knife, the grain-covered walls began to pulse. The organic writing shifted, rearranged itself into new patterns, and from somewhere deep in the facility's foundation, a sound began to build. Not voices this time. Something else. Something that might have been machinery, or might have been breathing, or might have been something far worse. "We need to leave," Carol said. "Right now." But as we turned to go, the opening we'd cut through the wall, it was gone, sealed over with fresh concrete, as if it had never been opened at all. We were trapped in Silo 7, trapped with the cocoons and the grain writing and whatever was making that terrible sound in the depths below. And that's when I realized. The voices we'd been hearing, the spirits of dead workers. They hadn't been trying to find peace. They'd been trying to warn us. The sound from below grew louder, rhythmic, like massive machinery but with an organic quality that made my skin crawl. Carol's team huddled together checking their equipment, looking for another way out. But I was studying the grain writing on the walls. The patterns were shifting, changing, and as I watched, they began to form recognizable shapes. Maps, diagrams. The grain storage network of Kansas wasn't just connected. It was alive. Each silo was a node in a vast organism that stretched across the entire state, maybe beyond. "Look at this," I called to the others, pointing at the wall. "It's showing us something." The grain patterns showed locations, hundreds of them. Grain elevators that existed on no official maps. Facilities that appeared and disappeared according to some alien logic. And at the center of it all, Hartwell, our facility, the hub, the heart of whatever this thing was. We're not just workers, I realized aloud. We're caretakers. We've been feeding this thing for decades without knowing it. The cocoons around us pulsed brighter, and I could see movement inside several of them. Not just the one man we'd already found, but others. Dozens of others. Workers from across Kansas, collected and preserved and what? What was the purpose? The grain writing shifted again, showing me new images. The cocoons opening. The preserved workers emerging, but changed. Different. Their eyes reflecting the same patterns as the grain writing. Their movements synchronized, purposeful. "It's building something," Danny whispered. "Using us to build something." The sound from below reached a crescendo and the floor began to vibrate. Whatever was down there, it was rising, coming up to greet its latest collection. Carol's equipment started going haywire. Radiation detectors screaming, air quality monitors flashing red warnings, electromagnetic field sensors spinning into ranges they weren't designed to measure. "This isn't possible," she kept repeating. "This violates every law of physics I know." But possibility had stopped mattering the moment we opened Silo 7. We were operating in a reality that followed different rules now. Rules written in grain and concrete and the slow, patient intelligence that had been growing beneath the Kansas prairie for decades. The man we'd freed from his cocoon was starting to change. His eyes were developing those same reflective patterns. His movements becoming more fluid, more coordinated, less human. "Fight it," I told him. "Whatever it's doing to you, fight it." He looked at me with those changing eyes and smiled. "Why would I fight it? I can see everything now, the whole network, the purpose. It's beautiful, Jake." He knew my name. I'd never told him my name. "The grain remembers," he continued. "Every worker who's ever touched it, every person who's spent time in the facilities, it learns from us, grows stronger, and soon what? Soon it won't need the facilities at all. It'll be ready to spread beyond Kansas, beyond the grain belt, into the cities, the suburbs, everywhere humans have built their little structures and thought they were in control." The floor cracked open beneath us, revealing a shaft that descended into absolute darkness. But the darkness wasn't empty. Things were moving in it, climbing up toward us with a sound like rustling leaves and grinding stone. Carol grabbed my arm. "The emergency radios. If we can reach the surface, call for help." But I knew there was no help coming. This thing had been growing for decades. How many people in positions of authority were already part of its network? How many emergency responders, government officials, facility inspectors? The first of the climbing things emerged from the shaft. It might have been human once, a grain elevator worker, maybe, from decades past. But now it was something else. Its skin had a texture like wheat stalks, and its movements were too fluid, too coordinated, too purposeful. More followed. An army of converted workers, each one perfectly preserved but fundamentally changed. They moved with single-minded purpose, approaching the cocoons, beginning some kind of harvesting process. "They're waking them up," Danny said. "All of them." The cocoons were opening. One by one, the preserved workers emerged. Some looked confused, disoriented. Others had that same reflective quality in their eyes. They'd been processed, converted, made part of the network, and they all looked at us with the same expectant expression. "Join us," they said in unison. "Make the transition willingly. It's easier that way." I looked at Carol, at Danny, at the growing crowd of converted workers surrounding us. We were outnumbered, outmatched, and trapped in a facility that was apparently far more than a grain storage system. But I also remembered something. The original voices. The 17 workers who'd died in accidents over the decades. They'd tried to warn us. They'd fought against this thing even after death. Some part of human consciousness could resist the conversion process. "The spirits," I said quietly to Carol and Danny. "The ones we heard earlier. They were fighting this, that's why they could still speak to us. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we have a choice. We can let this thing convert us willingly, or we can resist, fight back from the inside if necessary." The converted workers were closing in. The grain writing on the walls pulsed brighter, creating patterns that made my eyes water and my thoughts feel sluggish. "Time to choose," said the man we'd freed from the cocoon. His transformation was complete now. He looked human, but I could see the network's intelligence behind his eyes. "Join willingly, or be processed. Either way, you become part of something greater than yourself." "So tell me, what do you think Jake and his team should do? Is there a way to fight back against a network that's been growing for decades? And most importantly, how many grain elevators in your area might be part of something larger than they appear? Let me know in the comments below. Share your theories about agricultural conspiracies, your thoughts on what might be lurking in rural facilities across America, your own experiences with places that felt wrong. Because this story, it's far from over. Next week, I'll be revealing what choice Jake made, and whether anyone escaped Silo 7 alive. And I'll be sharing evidence that suggests this grain network might be spreading far beyond Kansas. The evidence that made me question everything I thought I knew about the food that feeds America.